So conducting interviews is one way in which social researchers can access the language of the word. Earlier in this series, we saw how important it was to read the interview responses correctly, to make sure we take their tone, their humour, their body language sensitively and appropriate to the context in which it was said. So this sensitivity to context is a skill we can use for interpreting other cultural texts. Cultural texts might include the field diaries we write, policy documents we look at, web pages we use, campaign materials, even documentaries and films. These are key resources we can use to understand the world. The interpretation of these texts is thus another key qualitative method, and one we're going to learn about in this podcast. As Dennis Cosgrove tells us, the kind of evidence that we now use for interpreting the symbolism of the landscapes around us is much broader than it's been in the past. Material evidence in the field and cartographic, oral, archival and other documentary sources remain valuable, but now we often find evidence in cultural products themselves, like paintings, poems, novels, folk tales, music, film and song. These can provide as firm a handle on the meanings and consequences of people and places as conventional, factual resources. So in this way, art, books and media can be used to interpret the worlds of exotic or mundane places. Even films and adverts can be employed to get at the social world. So in recent years, the prospect of studying the world in armchair with popcorn has become as popular as fieldwork study in the traditional sense. And there are many ways in which texts of all types can be read by different groups. It's vital, therefore, to take into account the context, both cultural and geographical, that existed when these texts were produced. How were meanings conveyed in these contexts? What was their significance? It is only through critically reflecting on the values of, for example, a swastika or a cross in different cultures, in different places, that we can appropriately read these cultural texts. As Jackson points out, it's an impoverished view of culture that stresses text, sign and discourse to the exclusion of context, action and structure. Meanings must always be related to the material context from which they derive. So texts are usually considered to be written material, books, manuscripts, poems, even maps. It's common for us to identify how these texts can often be read or interpreted in different ways. In a novel, for example, some readers will argue how the hero is really a villain. Others can guess the murderer before the final page. Others enjoy the author's interpretation but question it, while others still go along with the ride until the story's conclusion. The possibilities of these different readings or interpretations in relation to books or poems, or even other cultural texts like films, is quite familiar to us. Many social researchers begin to use the idea of text to help us understand how we should configure the social world as well. As Cosgrove and Duncan outline, conceptualising landscapes as configurations of symbols and signs leads inevitably towards methods which are more interpretive in nature. This interpretative strand in recent cultural geography develops the metaphor of the landscape as a text, the world as something we can read or interpret in the same way as a social document. So as Aitken has identified, these social researchers read landscapes, along with other cultural processes and institutions that go together to constitute the world. And we interpret these processes and institutions as texts. Instead of seeing the cultural landscape as simply the entity that is produced by a culture, the landscape is now seen as something that is inscribed with a range of meanings, inscribed by various social groups. The world therefore becomes a world of signs and symbols that we can read. They tell us how to behave, whether to walk or don't walk, whether to keep off the grass, where to smoke. They tell us where we're allowed to go and what we're allowed to do there. It's up to social researchers to study the meanings of these texts, to work out the meanings attached to them, the politics underpinning them, and how they are produced and reproduced in practice. So social research has therefore broadened the array of legitimate subjects and objects that are within the student's compass. It's done so by drawing on the work of French philosopher Roland Barthes. As Aitken tells us, in its most traditional form, a text is a written material, but the French philosopher Roland Barthes expanded this notion and to include many other communication systems such as fashion, etiquette and urban design. Today we read images such as paintings, maps and landscapes, along with other social, cultural, economic and political institutions, as texts. So Barthes argued that text functions as signs, communicating meaning and significance to others. He illustrated his point using the example of roses. Roses are perhaps in one sense just a flower, but if they're given on Valentine's Day, for example, they become more than this. It can be argued that roses come to signify love. They become more than a rose and become a symbol of passion and affection. In this way, the rose becomes a text that we can read. However, its meaning is not fixed and absolute. In different geographical, historical or cultural contexts, roses may mean different things. A rose may mean love, but it also might mean the symbol of England. Similarly, colours, for example, can mean different things in different contexts. Green, for example, might mean jealousy, envy, naivety, being Irish, or environmentalism. Think of the different things that a humble banana, for example, might signify.
A banana can therefore mean many different things in many different contexts. It's not straightforwardly one singular thing. So a banana may be something we have in our packed lunch, something that we have as a snack in the afternoon. But a banana in a different context might stand for a healthy diet. It might stand for vitamins and potassium, something that can improve ourselves and improve our health and well-being. In another context, in a cartoon or perhaps some sort of comedy film, it might stand for slapstick. It might be something that the main character is likely to fall over on or slip up on at some stage in the scene. In another context, it might even be seen as a racist weapon. In the 1980s and the 1990s, thrown onto football pitches, it was meant to be a derogatory act against certain football players. Bananas might also stand for inequalities and injustices in trade agreements, standing for the unfairness of particular trade agreements between the North and South. And just as the Marx Brothers suggest, sometimes a cigar is not just a cigar, a banana might be seen as some sort of sexual reference. So in many different contexts, a simple thing like a piece of fruit can stand for lots of different things.
So it's vital when approaching any text to consider the context in which it's being used. Texts in and of themselves don't have any clear inherent meaning, but meaning is infused in them by cultures. They become signs that stand for or represent our different concepts, ideas and feelings, and enable others to read or interpret that meaning in roughly the same way as we do. So meaning in whatever text we're referring to has to be actively read or interpreted. There are many ways to read different signs and symbols. Perhaps there might be one key reading, a dominant reading, where the reader accepts the key understanding of that symbol without question. There might be a negotiated reading, which questions part of the content, but does not question the dominant ideology which underlies the text. An example of this may be that we see a no smoking sign, but question whether this refers to all forms of smoking or just cigarettes. Could we smoke a pipe somewhere where this sign was displayed, for example? We could also have an oppositional reading of that text, which understands the dominant coding but rejects its values. An example of this may be that we park on a double yellow line, or walk across the grass despite a keep off the grass sign. There also may be an apparent reading. This dominant reading is not understood. In this case, we simply don't understand the meaning of the text. We perhaps are outside that culture and don't follow the significance of the symbol. Perhaps this is the case in the following examples. With this in mind, Marcus Dole outlines 5 key questions that we might ask when we critically reflect on a text. Firstly, how and for whom has it been produced? What codes, values, habits, stereotypes and associations does it draw upon? What kind of personal and group identities does that symbol or text promote, and how do they relate to other identities? And more importantly, what kind of work does it do? Who does it benefit and who does it disbenefit? Lastly, how might that symbol be deconstructed or misread? How might that social space be inhabited differently? Marcus Dole's final question brings to mind the range of ways in which different cultural texts can be interpreted by different groups. By coming to understand these, we come closer to making sense of the different and complex interactions between ourselves and the social world.